That's right, folks. It's another episode of What Happened to the Fantasy Football Best Series. That's right. What happened to Deebo, Samuel, and a bunch of other stud receivers that busted in 2022? We are still over heartbreak. We are still emotionally upset. And today we're going to open those wounds back up to talk about the key wide receiver busts for 2022. Before we do, we'll make sure you follow us across the board at Razzball Fantasy on YouTube, IG, and TikTok. And of course, make sure you go over to razzball.com. But today's show, let's get into the wide receiver bust for 2022. All right. The only man that's qualified to talk about busts this year, and that's Matthew Styles. You can follow him at Styles08 on Twitter. What's going on, Matt?
Well, to talk about a bust, you have to be a bust, right? So, second place in the two big money leagues. So I consider that a bust. But I'm happy to be here, and we're going to knock this out tonight. And or actually, I guess it's going to produce tomorrow, right? We'll put it live tomorrow. So I'll say we're going to knock this out this morning.
The world's live right now to watch us on YouTube, but of course, if you listen to us on the audio side, you'll be available tomorrow. Plus, the written article that Matt put together will be on the site tomorrow as well, so you can read it, you can listen to it, and you can watch it. We want to hit all those pain points for you, no matter what you need. So we got it all today. Today we're going to talk about wide receivers. Last week we talked about running backs. A couple things that we like to do on the show. First off, it's obvious. We can bring up all the guys who busted. But I think today's show is more about figuring out why they busted, but also, is it going to impact 2023 and beyond? I think those are very important questions for today's show to understand, okay, was it just a bad year from statistical reasons? Was there bad quarterback, offensive line? I think that's really the important thing about these shows. So I'm excited to get into it. We do have a master list of players that busted in 2022. These are all top 100 ADP guys who finish at least 5 spots or lower in points per game in PPR. So that's the key here. That's how I've been identifying busts. We have Deebo Samuel, Mike Evans, Michael Pittman, T. Higgins, DJ Moore, Mike Williams, Terry McLaurin, Cortland Sutton, Deontay Johnson, Allen Robinson, Jerry Jeudy, Brandon Cooks, Gabriel Davis, Juju, Darnell Mooney, Rashad Bateman, Adam Thielen, Elijah Moore, Hunter Renfrow, and Drake London. That's a decent amount of names, but all those guys pretty much didn't meet expectations. We're going to talk about 5 key ones today, but before we get into those top 5, was there any of these guys that you didn't really that kind of hurt a little more than the rest that you are going to talk about today, Matt?
We'll get to the guy that really hurt my feelings. But to me, I don't know. We probably better get into it. Otherwise, I'm going to spoil the fun.
All right. So let's talk about the top 5 wide receiver busts. One of the key ones we're going to talk about is Deebo Samuel. Before, though, we're going to get some guys that weren't as highly drafted as Deebo. But the first one I wanted to talk about was Brandon Cooks. Now, I purposely picked two of the guys today because I was higher than them. I drafted them in a decent amount of leagues. So I was curious what the hell happened. Brandon Cooks, positional, drafted as the wide receiver 23, finished as the wide receiver 49. Overall 56, finished overall 73. So overall, not terrible, but that wide receiver 23 to 49, you did not draft Brandon Cooks to be a top 50 wide receiver. You drafted him to be a top 24. So first things I like to look at are what changed. And at first glance, Tim Kelly gets fired. They promote the QB coach, Pep Hamilton. Doesn't seem like it's a big change, but Pep Hamilton is a different coordinator. He is not from – Tim Kelly came from the old regime with Bill O'Brien. Pep Hamilton came in with Lovie Smith, and they have ties from their days back in Chicago. So the change to Pep Hamilton might have been a bigger change than we thought. I think there might have been terminology changes. So, and it kind of, listen, Davis Mills looked decent last year. He did not look as good this year, unfortunately. So I think maybe some of that happened a little bit. So I want to take note that there was change because in our show preseason, we said one of the things you try to avoid when it comes to wide receivers is change. A change at quarterback, change at scheme, change in coordinator, anything you can do to avoid that, it's usually helpful. So he dropped by 3 PPR points from last year. His targets were about 1.4 less than last year. His catch rate was about 6. He had 6% drop in catch rate. He, of course, missed 3 games, which doesn't help. But a lot of that stuff seems like, yeah, the 1.4 targets per game that's notable, but it's not enough to justify why he dropped 3 PPR points per game. But one of the things I did notice was he had no deep touchdowns. So last year, he had 3 touchdowns of 40 plus, which is kind of an outlier. That right there, think about it, a 40-yard touchdown catch is 10 fantasy points. You do that 3 times, that's essentially 2 points per game, especially in this 16, 17 games. So that's a huge nut. Go from 3 to 0. He was not a big threat down the field, and he also saw a spike in a 5% increase in his drop rate this year. So even though there was a little bit more competition, I guess, for targets between Nico Collins and some of those other guys, but at the overall, it's just very confusing why he dropped by 1.4. I unfortunately cannot say we don't know the future of Brandon Cooks. We don't even know who the Texans quarterback head coach will be, so it's hard to say. But honestly, when I went into this, I was hoping to come up with a better answer. This is the one where I walked away and said, I have no idea how we could have predicted he would drop off. The one thing I will say, though, is, because I'll bring up the stat again later, deep touchdown passes of 40-plus are not sticky. Guys who do that typically don't repeat it unless you're an elite threat like Jamar Chase, for example. All the guys, 6 of the 8 guys last year who had 3 or more deep touchdowns of 40-plus yards had a drop in points the next year because they did not meet that expectation again. So maybe that's what it was for Brandon Cooks, but overall, not too excited. Any thoughts about Brandon Cooks, Matt, before we jump into the next one?
Yeah, so the research you did was really between last year and this year. What I went back and looked all the way to back when he was a rookie. Did you know that Cooks has never had a 100-catch season?
Yeah, it's true.
And right, going into the draft, you feel that this guy is a target hog. So he is a target hog. He continued to do that through last year, but this year he didn't. I think you mentioned Davis Mills was different than he was last year than he was this year. I find it confusing that they had a good running game, right? Dameon Pierce made people where they couldn't just double out wide. And then to me, the one thing that is concerning to me is, yes, Houston was bad, like atrociously bad. Not Chicago bad, but close.
They wish. Wish they were.
But he pulled the wide receiver diva card, right? You said he missed 3 games. Okay, so maybe 1.5 of those is a little bit of injury. But then he pulled the Terrell Owens, Keyshawn Johnson, Antonio Brown card, and he just said, I'm not playing for this team anymore, sat out. Now, do we know he said that? No. But he came down with the diva-esque illness, and he didn't play for a while. And when you look back at his stats, he's a 1,000-yard receiving guy, regardless of the number of catches. He's always a middling 5 to 7 touchdown guy, and all of those things regress. So the analytical figures that you provided, right, those make sense, and all of that translated to less everything, to include the long touchdowns, to include touchdowns overall, to include catches, and to include yards. So when you have a wide receiver that you covet, right? I was looking at him as wide receiver 3 or 4. You had him probably a little bit higher. But when he fell to me at wide receiver 4, I was ecstatic. I went through the roof. And he ended up being drop material. I kept him until I just couldn't keep him anymore. So to me, it didn't make sense. Now, when we take Cooks, and I say it didn't make sense, that leads me to the next guy. The next guy on our list is Michael Pittman. And I wrote in my article, you read it tomorrow. I'm still scratching my head. Would you, if I paid you $5 for the over/under on 90 catches for Michael Pittman this year, knowing that you watched him, knowing what he did, what do you think the over/under is? 90 is the number.
Yeah, obviously the under, I would think, but
he had 99 catches.
That's crazy. That's funny.
He had 10 weeks between his first and second touchdown. He had 4 total touchdowns. The last 2 were in the last 2 weeks of the year, which means the week 18 one, for fantasy purposes, doesn't matter. Nobody cares. So the dude regressed in yardage, but he went up in catches. He went up in it. How you can go up in catches he went up in targets by 12, catches by 11, yet he dropped by 150 total yards. I still am. I want to go back and look at the numbers. I looked at them 4 or 5 times today when I was writing the article. I cannot figure it out. Now, you're going to touch on the fact that Indianapolis was awful year for start to finish. Matt Ryan was not the same guy that played in Atlanta. Jonathan Taylor wasn't the same guy that had 18 touchdowns rushing last year. The offensive line wasn't good, but 99 catches, I can't figure it out. I can't. It doesn't make sense to me.
So I loved Pittman. I always said in the beginning of the year I was into the Mikes, Michael Williams, Michael Pittman, Mike Evans. Those are the guys I really liked in the 3rd round this year. Didn't really work out, unfortunately. Pittman, listen, when he played with Matt Ryan, he was 6th in receptions with 76 and inside the top 20 in yards. So the touchdowns weren't there. Matt Ryan's just a disaster at this stage in his career in the red zone. But, I think the problem was we thought Matt Ryan was going to be a clear upgrade on Carson Wentz, and he wasn't. And this circles back to, and I said this in an earlier show, when I'd rather even if we think it's a slight upgrade at QB, unless it's a Matthew Stafford type jump or a Tom Brady type jump at quarterback, those marginal ones, give me the continuity of that QB. Give me Carson Wentz again, because I know what I'm getting with Michael Pittman with Carson Wentz versus the slight upgrade to Matt Ryan. And I think that's a philosophy I'm going to take moving forward. I'm not going to draft players at their ADPs if I feel like they're too high, if they have a slight QB change, because we all think we know Deontay Johnson, wink, wink, coming up too. Ironically, the same freaking issue. We thought Big Ben sucked. Big Ben, but we know what Big Ben did? He targeted Deontay Johnson 12 fucking times a week. Excuse my French. I have a toothache. All right, let's jump down to the next one. Allen Robinson. Oh, baby boy. Allen Robinson, was drafted as the wide receiver 21, finished as the wide receiver 63. Not just overall in PPR points per game, folks. So we didn't get cute here and said, oh, overall he was, because he missed so many. No, this is per game. So that's just horrendous. 52nd overall, finished outside the top 120. Oh, just awful. Moved to a new team. But this is the one where, I actually have some interesting things I thought about first off. One of the things that the Rams went through in 2019 is their offensive line got injured. They moved a bunch of players around. They couldn't run the football. That was the year Todd Gurley went from the number 1 player in fantasy to just dust. And the offense just didn't look right. So they went through a transition year, the bad offensive line, they couldn't run the ball. Well, in 2022, it was the offensive line again, but it was in pass protection. They were one of only 2 teams in the NFL to allow an adjusted sack rate over 10%. So 10% of the dropbacks, they're essentially getting sacked on offense. So the offensive line was absolutely disastrous. No Andrew Whitworth, a bunch of injuries up front. And I think that caused a lot of problems. If you look at Matthew Stafford, more pressures. In the first 8 games of 2021, he had 51 pressures. In 2022, that jumps to 90 in the same amount of games. So nearly double. So Matthew Stafford under pressure. The offensive line couldn't protect. And I think that led Matthew Stafford to just go to the middle of the field where he's comfortable, the Cooper Kupp and Tyler Higbee early on in the year. Now, one of the things I first thought was, okay, maybe he's dusted. Well, the cool thing is Matt Harmon does reception perception. And in his reception perception about Allen Robinson, he says that, yes, there is a slight dip, but he's within expectation. So he's still winning routes at a pretty nice clip. So against verse man, he's over 70%. Against zone, he's over 75%. Against press, he's at 73%. So he's still winning routes consistently, according to Matt Harmon, who really takes a dive into this. So I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe there's a separation issue. Well, his career average separation, according to Next Gen Stats, is 2.1. Okay, he averaged 2.1 this year. So it's clearly Allen Robinson isn't all of a sudden just bad. And then I thought, well, maybe it's Matthew Stafford. Maybe Matthew Stafford is one of those guys who doesn't like to throw to contested players. So I took a journey back to 2019 Kenny Golladay. That's right. Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay, who caught like 7 passes for the Giants this year. Back in 2019, whatever. It probably is 6. Kenny Golladay in 2019 was absolutely dominant with Matthew Stafford. And I looked back, and sure enough, his average separation was like 2.3. Matthew Stafford would just throw it downfield to Calvin Johnson. He would throw it downfield to Kenny Golladay. So that's not an issue. So I think when I went into all this, it was a disaster year for the Rams. But McVay's back. I think they're going to make some adjustments to the offensive line. Plus, their offensive line did start playing better over the second half of the year with Baker Mayfield and company. So I do think that they put it together. And Allen Robinson's going to be super cheap next year. And I might be in on Allen Robinson. So what's your thoughts about A-Rob?
So I am probably in on Robinson before I'm in on Cooks. But I don't know that I'm in on him before I'm in on Pittman and our next guy. With Robinson, though, you remember when he was basically the best receiver in fantasy football for the Jaguars in his second year. 14 touchdowns. He had everything, right? He didn't win the Triple Crown, but he was damn close to winning the Triple Crown that year. Then he somehow floats over to Chicago. And do you remember who his quarterback was in Chicago when he blew up 2 straight years?
Mitch Trubisky.
Again, what?
It doesn't make sense.
Right. It doesn't make any sense because Matthew Stafford is better by a long ways than Trubisky. Again, right? 3 in a row that we've said I don't understand it. Scratch my head, I don't understand it. Now the next guy, and you're right, the 63 number 63 overall points per reception guy is going to be hella cheap next year. So sneak him in as your wide receiver of 3 really late, right? Maybe get that other running back. Maybe take your shot at your quarterback and know that Robinson will be there. Now, back to your comment about quarterback changes, coordinator changes. We have to watch the Rams in the offseason. If Aaron Donald really does retire, if Stafford's back is really a problem, right? If all those things lead to Bryce Perkins or is it Wolford?
No, I think Baker will be back.
Possible, but how much does Baker want to get paid, right? Are the Rams willing to do that? And
who the hell's paying Baker? Who's paying Baker? Like, seriously.
They've leveraged all their draft capital, so they can't fix through the draft.
No.
It's confusing. I would want to watch all the moving pieces, right? If you're arranging deck chairs on the Titanic, you're going to sink and die anyway. So they may just have to suck the egg and figure it out. But for the next guy, I love him. I will always love him, I think. I say that now. This guy I was so high on, and everywhere I got him, I was absolutely ecstatic. 147 targets, no touchdowns. That's the end of the analysis. There is nothing more to say.
Beautiful.
We all hated Ben Roethlisberger, but if you waited to draft quarterbacks when he was in his prime, you were going to get 4,500 yards and 30-some-odd touchdowns because they were not going to run the football. He couldn't back up, right? So he took everything out of the shotgun, and he loved Deontay Johnson. I wrote in the article that Pickett to Pickens seemed a lot more dynamic. It seemed to be fit for Pickens and for Pickett. And Deontay Johnson was the guy that kind of got left out a little bit, even though he still got his. I think he's getting rid of the drops, right? He's not as drop prone as he was in years past. But Pittsburgh was not good. Najee Harris was not Najee Harris for most of the year. So they were just a bad offense going in. So I still like Deontay Johnson going into 2023, but I want to see Mike Tomlin name a starter and name a starter early at quarterback.
Yeah, it's going to be Kenny Pickett. I'm not worried. I think it's, for me, it could be the Miles Sanders thing from last year where Miles Sanders had all those touches, didn't get any touchdowns, and then positive regression. I just wanted to take a look, though, because where the red zone looks are really the key. And he had 38 in 2021. He had 38, and he turned 8 of those into touchdowns. So 38 red zone targets into 8 touchdowns. Last year, he had 30, and he had 0. So that's fluky. I mean, when you're getting – he had 11 end zone targets, meaning the ball in the end zone, he had 0 touchdowns. That's a lot. I wonder if that's the most. No, oh yeah. So he's the only player with double-digit end zone targets without a touchdown. And by the way, the next person's 2, and that's Cortland Sutton. And
Yeah.
Justin Jefferson, believe it or not. That's crazy. Justin Jefferson had 14 end zone targets, only 2 touchdowns this year.
Ooh.
Crazy. All right, there you go. Interesting. Listen, I'm in it. I'll admit this one I was correct on. I was off Deontay this year. I was, because I was like, I was like, Big Ben, that little change to Mitch Trubisky. I'm like, we don't know. And I like how I take that philosophy with Deontay. I don't apply it to Michael Pittman, but I am an idiot and I don't care. So don't hate me for it. Anyway, let's go to the last one.
I always say we're not going to take accountability unless it's in our favor.
Exactly. You get me. I like it. Deebo Samuel's the last one. And Deebo, Deebo took a little bit more time to get into him because obviously there were some easy ones like the rushing production and all that. But I was genuinely surprised. He was kind of almost as efficient on the ground this year. It wasn't as big as a drop-off as I thought. But anyway, wide receiver 7 drafted and finishes the wide receiver 26 in PPR points per game. He was drafted as a top 20 guy, finished 49th overall. So it's not too crazy, but when you're drafting a guy in the second round and he doesn't even finish as a top 24 wide receiver, that's a problem. So here's one of the things I noticed right away. His entire role changed in the offense for some reason. And it's hard to notice it on the field. His average depth of target dropped from 8.4 to 4.3. That's never a good thing. You want air yards. You want targets down the field. It's very difficult, even for a stud like Deebo, to generate that many yards after the catch. So that drop off in 4 yards in average depth of target is huge, especially when you're talking 7 targets a game. That's upwards to like 30 yards alone in air yards that you're not going to be able to get. It's really tough to get that all back in yards after the catch. 2021, he had 14 deep targets. He turned them, that's passes over 20 yards. He finished 8 receptions, 374 yards, 3 touchdowns. This season, he had 3 of those for 1 catch for 32 yards. So the production dipped by more than 90% in deep passing. So they weren't using him down the field. He had a lower ADOT. And finally, the red zone touchdowns. He had 6 rushing touchdowns last year in the red zone. This year, he only had 2. So that hurt. I mean, his rushing production, he still got the carries. He just wasn't finding the end zone. I think teams maybe got a little bit wiser to what they were doing with him there. And maybe they got some film and they were able to stop him. But he had 6 last year on roughly the same amount of carries. So they were still using him. But he dropped all the way down to 2. But I think the biggest key of it all is Christian McCaffrey. There is a huge difference in his production with McCaffrey. So before McCaffrey arrived, weeks 1 through 6, 15.5 PPR points per game. That's right around top 12 to 15. That drops all the way down to 11.3 after he joined the team. Now, everything changed with CMC. His touches, his targets went down. The other thing I thought was interesting was the 49ers in 2020 and 2021, I thought they didn't use running backs in the passing game. But according to Fantasy Pros and how they break up their targets, they were not too much of a spike. It was a little bit of a spike, but not too much. So it wasn't just the receiving target CMC got. It's just the fact that the offense became too cluttered. It was Kittle, Ayuk, CMC. And then you have another running back in Elijah Mitchell when he's healthy. And then Juwan Jennings was getting involved. So there just wasn't enough pieces of the pie. So I think I'm probably going to be pretty hands-off Deebo next year. Even if he regresses back a little bit upwards, maybe closer to 13. But 11.3 is concerning with CMC. What's your thoughts about Deebo?
Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing, right? Kittle was turned off for much of the year, right? Sky always jokes that he, if it was pancake blocks, he'd be tight end 1.
Tight end 1.
Yep. And they went through the running back carousel again, right? Injuries. They released Trey Sermon before the season. So there was a lot of turmoil at running back. And then, frankly, right, if you want really hard-hitting analysis, hopefully you're sitting down. Kyle Shanahan doesn't give a fuck about your fantasy team.
Which is bullshit.
I know. It just, I mean, somebody should call him out, right? We should probably get him on the show and ask him, why don't you care about our fantasy football team?
Let's get on it.
But really, maybe that shows that he's really a good coach because he looks at trends the right way, whereas we just look at points and what does well for us. But look where they are, right? So maybe his usage of Deebo or his non-usage of Deebo was the right thing to do. Maybe it extends the guy's career. But they also had quarterback turmoil. They lose their number one on the opening week, and then Garoppolo gets dinged, and then also he's out, and Purdy was throwing to CMC and Kittle. So it just, and by the way, why wouldn't you, right? Two fantastic pass catchers. So to me, I'm a little bit, I wasn't really high on Deebo. I ended up with him at the beginning of the second round this year because it just worked out that way, and I didn't want to pass on him, but I'm not as high this year. In fact, I'm probably lower on Deebo 2023 than I was Pittman 2022, and I took Pittman at 3.02. So that would push Deebo down the list in the third round, maybe into the fourth for me.
I will say this. His touches were still good. So if you just look at what I always like to look at is red zone works, because that's the high value touches. In 13, he only played 13 games, so he did miss more time this year, but he had 17 red zone targets in those 13 games. Last year, in 16 games, he had 17 red zone targets. So he actually had more looks in the red zone in less games, but he just didn't find the end zone this year. So is it a little fluky? Yes. But I think next year, if you're someone that wants to play the regression game, back to the mean or whatever, you have to start at that 11.4 or 11.3 and say, all right, even if he regresses from there, it's 13 points, and that's where you judge Deebo, not from what he did 2 years ago, because CMC is a major factor. All right, that's it, folks. That's our top 5 wide receiver busts. What happened to Deebo Samuel? Hopefully we figured it out. What happened to Deebo, Michael Pittman, Brandon Cooks, Deontay Johnson, and more on this show. I want to thank Matthew Styles. Matt, do you want to highlight anything else before we close out about your article that's dropping tomorrow? Any key insights?
No, there's a couple extra names that you saw running at the bottom of the screen. Just some quips about them, but pretty much we covered the big stuff. And as always, Sky would tell you, I'm batting 1,000 on questions and comments answered at the site. So if you've got something you want to know, we'll do the research and we'll hit you back up. So 100% response rate.
And honestly, batting 1,000 just always brings us back to baseball, because that's what we do here at Razzball. We do baseball, hockey, basketball, and football. Go check it out over on Razzball.com. Make sure you subscribe to the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And check out our boys tomorrow. The Dynasty Diehards will be dropping their shows every Wednesday on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And, of course, go check out baseball. Gray's out, dropping his podcast. It's going to be huge. We're super excited. Thanks for joining us again. I want to thank Matthew Styles. Make sure you go follow this guy at Styles08 on Twitter. We are out of here.